Hey everybody, it is Poober here for episode 25 of my Factorio series. You are joining me just as we are in the middle of a brownout going on, and unfortunately this has been happening about halfway through every Factorio night cycle lately, which is especially unfortunate because I have thousands and thousands of solar panels and accumulators, and especially with the addition of this new nuclear reactor facility, I was hoping that my electrical demand would be met a lot longer than it has been. So for the first thing we're going to be doing in today's episode, I am going to be ripping this up and replacing it with something with a lot more wattage to hopefully last us a lot longer. We are starting here in the middle of this large, wide open square area just above the main base here. And I was hoping that we can now begin filling this in with a new nuclear reactor facility, but the one I have in mind, unfortunately, does not fit, as you guys can tell. And this is especially a huge bummer because I spent the last couple of hours actually designing this in my test world. But the one thing I didn't do was actually take a blueprint of the shape of this square over to my test world to help me design that, which is why it ended up being a lot bigger than I had planned. So I have either two options. Either I can completely redesign a nuclear reactor setup, or option two is I can kind of cut my losses, shed off a little bit of the edges, and then hopefully that way we can still fit it in this square area a little bit. I think I'm probably leaning towards that option because I am, of course, more aesthetically inclined than a lot of Factorio players are, so this is unfortunately a little bit more important to me to have this kind of fit how I want it. But I think it'll end up turning out really cool and looking really cool in the end. One thing I have to do first is actually extend this out so it's going to be a lot taller or wider from top to bottom. So this won't be a complete square, whereas it won't be completely even on all sides, but you'll hardly notice it. I think once the nuclear reactor facility is fully installed, it should look pretty symmetrical. So with that said, I have a lot of work cut out for me. Let me go ahead and start tearing stuff down. Well, it has been quite some time later, and I've ended up reconfiguring a couple of things. One of the first ones you'll notice is that we have actually made use of this train station here. It is now dropping off our rocket fuel onto our main bus. I figure this is going to be a good purpose for it since our rockets are going to need a ton of rocket fuel anyway. Plus it can feed into supplying our nuclear fuel down here near our Covarex enrichment process section anyway. And then the other thing is I ended up changing this train station so it now picks up our nuclear fuel and then our fuel cells as well, which will then deliver to our new nuclear reactor plant. So we're going to hop in and jump on over there. I haven't actually turned the factory on. It's this massive blue thing you can see here just at the top. So we're going to head over there now and hopefully everything will work as planned. This will be the first time that we actually get the fuel cells dropped off. And you can see kind of moving around it just how massive it is. But let's hop out here. So I have the nuclear fuel cells getting dropped off here. I've got a little bit of a condition here on our belt line where if we have less than 16 nuclear fuel cells into this box, right there, then it will let the nuclear fuel cells through. But if we have more than 16, it will stop right here. That way we don't get too much waste on our belt line. But let's walk further in and we'll talk a little bit about this design here. Now this design was inspired by Lisp Wizard's design, and I used basically all of his components for the smarts for this. So you'll see a ton of these arithmetic combinators and decider combinators around here. There's a ton of smarts that I couldn't really explain, but I was able to kind of regurgitate and duplicate what he was able to do. But I'll go over that in just a second here. But what I did design on my own was I changed up the nuclear reactor configuration a little bit. His was more circular and then centrally located for the combinators and things like that. But essentially the rows of the boilers here, or the heat exchangers, are pretty much the same as what he had. So I had in the original design about 120 per side, and then the original blueprint was the golden rule, so it had the correct number of the steam turbines per the heat exchangers. But now, as you guys remember from the opening clip, I did kind of cut it down on the side, so this is no longer ratio perfect, or as close to ratio perfect as it was prior. But if you would like the ratio perfect version of the blueprint, please let me know and I will include it in the comments down below. But again, we have our nuclear fuel cells come up through here. Our empty nuclear fuel cells will then get deposited onto this belt line here and then back onto the same train where we came in through. We have a couple of these solar panels and accumulators. That way we can still charge this factory, so we at least have some sort of power so that we can always get at least some sort of electricity produced, and this will always be up and running via some sort of fashion. It may not be to 100% capacity, but it'll be working at least somewhat. And then again, the rows of the heat exchangers. And now we can see these are turning on. That's awesome. So how this works, we've got a ton of these decider combinators next to each of these requester chests. And there are only 2 bots required for this entire thing. We basically have one that supplies the fuel cells and one that takes away the empty fuel cells to these requester boxes here. But then it goes in a clockwise fashion turning on, where we have this one, which is n equals 0, meaning this one is always on. But then with this kind of assortment of other combinators and things like that spread throughout, including like this section over here, others over here, and then 2 more to each corner. So here and here. Basically, it reads the system and decides if we are too low on steam as backup. After every like 375 ticks, I believe, it kind of reassesses the situation and determines whether we need more nuclear fuel cells into the system. If more nuclear fuel cells are needed, it is put into the boxes and then eaten up by the nuclear reactors. That way we don't get an overcharge of the nuclear reactors, meaning that they're not constantly going, they're only going if needed. So that way we don't get as much waste as other designs might. So that's something clever. Again, all credit for the circuit network goes to Lisp Wizard for that. And then over here is my same speaker system that we used in my 0.15 map, so some of you might recognize this. But how this works is that if we have less than 10 of the nuclear fuel cells in this box over here, this green light will turn red and this speaker will start alarming, and we'll also get a visual cue on our map kind of blinking at us if we were to look at it this way. So that way we know to kind of respond to this situation as soon as possible, or else we are going to be basically out of power. But that's another nice feature about this design. And then of course you'll notice that I have a ton of these tanks for our storage of steam. That way we can store the steam and then get back up to 100% up and running even if the nuclear reactors themselves aren't fully up and running at 100%. I also tried to make use of the nuclear reactor bonuses, so these will be at least 200 to 300% for the neighbor bonus. I think that's about as max as it does go, unfortunately, but it still does make use of that. But apart from that, I think that sums up this design here. I would like to see it more up and running. I don't think we're going to do that though until we demolish the other nuclear reactor facility, so I'm going to go ahead and do that next. So I just got done demolishing the original nuclear reactor build, and now you can see this one is now working. You can see the steam turbines kind of synced with turning on from the left to right, as well as top to bottom. So it looks pretty cool. The original design of this, before I kind of shaved off the sides, would produce about 4 gigawatts of energy. Looking at it now, it's nowhere near that because of course we're not even needing that much, but you can see we have so much more capacity for production that I imagine it will make close to 4 gigawatts once the demand requires it. Another thing I'll add is the fact that this design wouldn't be possible without the water fill mod, which is where you see these water channels that I placed earlier. And that's only for aesthetic purposes. You could of course use this design by placing it as an island over a large area of water and get it to work that way, or you could install the water mod like I did and put in the channels so it looks more aesthetically pleasing. But I think that is enough talk about nuclear reactor facilities for now. I think the next thing I want to do now that we have the energy capabilities is to start adding in beacons to our main smelting designs. So we still have so much room for our steel smelter and our copper and iron plate smelters to add in these beacons here that will have our speed 3 modules installed in those. So I think that's what I want to do next so we can really start amping up our productivity and getting our smelting capacity even higher. That way we can delve even further into mega base territory. Alright, off camera, I was able to install all of the beacons that are now near the smelting area. Hundreds and hundreds of beacons, so you can imagine that we're going to be probably using thousands of the Speed 2 modules just in the smelter section alone for the steel. I haven't even begun to touch the copper smelting or the iron plate smelting over here, so I'm going to have to add in the beacons and the speed modules over here eventually. And of course I still have the Productivity 3 modules to still finish installing in the smelters themselves. But I think I'm going to finish off the steel smelting first, but before we do that I wanted to check in with our module production factory over here and just look at what we have available. So at the moment I'm feeling quite rich, to be honest. All of my lights are at the full color capacity, which means I have all of my conditions fully met. I even have a little bit more than that because I knew I would be spending a ton on my smelting factories. So for the Speed Module 3s, I have 1800 in here along with 1800 for the Productivity 3 modules. But like we mentioned, that is all going to be spent in just a minute here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera, and I will see you then in just a minute once that's done. Well, quite some time later, and I was able to get all of the modules installed into the beacons and the actual smelters themselves. It was thousands and thousands of modules between the Productivity and Speed Module 3s that went into the steel smelter alone. I still have a couple left over of the Speed Module 3s, but obviously I still have a long ways to go before I can be fully built back up to where we were previously. I do have the conditions set to put modules into this box here if we have less than 1.8 thousand. So obviously I have a long ways to go before I meet that requirement. But I think with that, we're going to go ahead and call this episode here because it's been a productive episode nevertheless. I'm going to go ahead and let those modules build up over time before I get to work on the copper plate and iron plate smelting. But by next episode, I will have it done. And we'll get to work on episode 26 with our low density structure factories and our rocket control unit factories. Hope to see you then.